Week 1, Unit 7, Legacy, where we look at Egypt in the modern world. And we'll start here with Cherami's King Tut Saloon in Louisiana. This picture taken from the 1930s. Your best and last chance, fine drinks of all kind, curb service, tourist information. Well, what is a bar in rural Louisiana in the 1930s doing being named after King Tut? Well, King Tut was very popular in the 1920s and 30s. The discovery by Howard Carter and others of King Tut's tomb in the early 1920s created a sort of pop culture fad for anything Egyptian. And really, Egyptian stuff has permeated the culture in one way or another ever since, as we'll see over the next few minutes. Here, for example, is the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas with a replica of the Sphinx that's bigger than the actual Sphinx. It looks very modern, it looks very new, but it also looks very old and very Egyptian. What does the pyramids and the Sphinx have to do with gambling and fine hotels in the 21st century? Well, the connection is kind of unclear, though I suppose Las Vegas is in the desert the same way that the pyramids and the Sphinx are in the desert, but also there's a sense of grandeur, of greatness, and it's interesting that even now in the 21st century, when we look for something really grand and impressive, we go back to some of the oldest things we have, like the pyramids, like the Sphinx. Popular culture didn't just focus on pharaohs and sphinxes and pyramids. It also focused, of course, on the mummy, which becomes in the 20th century a sort of horror film character that appears over and over again. This is one of the very first versions of this from 1932. Boris Karloff is the mummy. It comes to life. And this was part of a series of films that were made by Universal Pictures, Frankenstein, Dracula, and also the Mummy. And we get this sort of Egyptian theme in horror films. Of course, there have been other mummy movies since. And here's Revenge of the Mummy, The Ride. And you can see, again, ancient Egypt is being brought into the modern world as a form of entertainment, as a kind of exoticism, as something scary. The connections with mummies and death are not being taken entirely seriously here, but there's still a kind of spooky quality to ancient Egyptian things, partly because of mummies and the focus on death and so on. Very little of what happens in mummy movies has anything to do with actual burial practice in ancient Egypt, but that's not really the point, is it? Well, it's not only our period that looks back to ancient Egypt. Here is The Tragedy of Antony and Cleopatra by William Shakespeare, and this is from Shakespeare's first folio, published in 1623. 1600 years or so after the death of Antony and Cleopatra, Shakespeare's still writing plays about the story of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, how they fell in love and how they fought with the Emperor Augustus for control of the Roman Empire, and how they famously lost, and how they both committed suicide, Cleopatra famously killing herself by being bitten by an asp. And the figure of Cleopatra has never stopped really fascinating people since her death. She was famous in her own time, and she's been famous ever since. One of the interesting things about Cleopatra is that she was actually ethnically Greek. She was descended from the Greeks who took over Egypt at the time of Alexander the Great, and she was the last Greek to rule Egypt before the Romans took over. Cleopatra was popular in the 19th century. Here's Lily Langtry, the famous actress from the 19th century. She's playing Shakespeare's Cleopatra on stage. She was also the mistress of the Prince of Wales in England at the time. Very famous celebrity from the 19th century, and here she is as Cleopatra. We have other Cleopatras. Here's Claudette Colbert as Cleopatra from the 1930s film. So at the same time that Boris Karloff was the mummy, Claudette Colbert was Cleopatra, and of course, most famously of all, we have Liz Taylor as Cleopatra from this enormous movie that came out in the early 1960s. The movie was an enormous flop. It's not very successful, but it was very, very long, very, very over the top, and it featured Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor as Antony and Cleopatra. Dick and Liz do Tony and Cleo, and was maybe the height of the Hollywood blockbuster. It's not just movies that dramatize ancient Egypt. Here is the vocal score to Giuseppe Verdi's opera Aida from 1872. And you can see there Aida and her beloved locked in the tomb. They've been buried alive. They're going to die, but they sing a lot first. Beautiful beautiful music. And Aida was actually written for a premiere of the Opera House in Cairo. And so you've actually got a real Egyptian connection there, as Egypt is going through a phase where it's being dominated by European imperialism in the 19th century. You see opera moving to Egypt, and Egypt adopting opera. And these productions toured all over the world. Here's Aida from Cleveland, Ohio at the Hippodrome Opera Company. And it shows how this kind of exoticism around Egypt travels all over the Western world in the 19th and 20th centuries. This is a representation of the famous scene in Act 2 of the opera where there's an enormous procession. People bring on elephants. It's generally the most lavish scene in the opera canon. If a producer wants to show just how over the top they can go, they'll put on a production of Aida and bring on the elephants. Well, perhaps on a little more serious note, people have been pillaging ancient Egypt and taking bits of it back home to their own countries ever since. Here's an obelisk from Luxor in Egypt that was put up at the Place de la Concorde in Paris. This is the site where where in the French Revolution the guillotine stood, and after the revolution was over, they decided that that was a little much, and that it would be much more dignified and impressive to have an obelisk there. So they went to Egypt, took an obelisk, brought it back to Paris, and put it up in the center of the city, where it is to this day. There are similar obelisks in London and New York, and, of course, in Rome, which has more obelisks from Egypt than anywhere else, even Egypt. This is the obelisk in St. Peter's Square in front of the Vatican. It was brought to Rome by Caligula in 40 AD, so as you can see, looking to Egypt for ideas of splendor, power, glamour, and exoticism goes all the way back to really the dawn of the Christian era, if not before.